All right. So yesterday we spoke about the daily stand-up meeting. We spoke about the planning, sprint planning meeting, and we talked about the rules, who is invited, how long it takes, and what we do during those meetings. Okay. And the review, I think we stopped here yesterday. We mentioned that the review has the goal to give the opportunity to the stakeholders and the product owners to give the feedback and to receive the demonstration of what has been created as part of the product increment. It allows them to make any change if needed and to provide any feedback to improve for the next sprint or the next product increment. Okay. And I said during the sprint review, the Scrum team is present, and also any stakeholders that has any parts or any stakes into the product can be invited as well. Okay, so now we decided to talk about the retrospective, which is the moment where the team has the opportunity to look back on what they did on the previous sprint or the ending sprint, okay? Because it has how it's gonna happen at the end of any sprint. And it gives the team the opportunity to inspect what work they did, what processes they followed, what went well, what did not, what they need to improve, and they put together a plan to actually add more value in the next sprint or correct whatever did not go well, okay? So it's a way to increase the quality and the effectiveness. The Scrum Master, the PO, and the dev team, which is the Scrum team, are present because the retrospective is for the team to look back on what they did on the previous sprint or the current ending sprint, I should say. Okay. We decide to talk about what went well. We do put a plan to improve what did not. We inspect anything that is around the working practices, the communications, the tools that we use, the environment, and we reassess the definitions of done. Okay, we're going to come into what is the definition of done later on when we went toward the end of this this class. Okay, but on a high level, the definitions of done is the set of criteria. We also call them exit criteria. It's the set of criteria that is allowing the team to say that they completed a product increment. Okay, it's like a checklist that you need to sign on, which all the items needs to be signed off on to decide that the product increment is completed. Okay, so we reassess that list during each retrospective, and if anything was missing before, we can add. If there's anything that is not necessary, we can take that off. So it's a time to reevaluate what is in the definitions of done as well. And we identify the most helpful changes to improve the effectiveness of the plan to implement the next sprint. That's very important. During the test, they're going to be asking you what is actually the output of the sprint retrospective, okay? This is one important bullet point, okay? They're going to give you a lot of answers, a lot of options, and some of them are not going to have identified the most helpful changes to improve the effectiveness and plan to implement them next sprint. So every single retrospective, you need to come up with a plan to improve what did not go well on the current sprint or on the previous sprint. You need to come up with a plan, and you need to be able to change something, especially the ones that did not go well. Okay, so that's one of the goals of the retrospective. All right, before we move on to the artifacts, any questions on the Scrum events? We spoke about the sprint planning, daily stand-up meeting, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. Any questions at all? All right, so now let's talk about the Scrum artifacts. What are the Scrum artifacts that exist into this process? What Scrum artifacts exist into this process?
The product backlog is part of it.
Yes. You have the product backlog. What else?
Sprint backlog.
Correct. What else? There's the last one. The last one is what? The product increment. Okay. And also some documentation, some old documentation are going to tell you that the burn-down chart is part of the artifacts. That's not correct. So the only three Scrum artifacts are the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the product increment or increment. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the product backlog. I think that's one thing we discussed a little bit about when we spoke about the core role product owner, right? So the product backlog is an ordered list of the requirements that is maintained for a product and is ever changing. I mentioned all that before multiple times because that's really important. It's really important. I said yesterday that the product backlog is ever changing, right? It's adapting, okay? And during the sprint review, the product owner and the stakeholders and the Scrum team in general have the opportunity of modifying things in the product backlog, okay? And the beauty of Agile or Scrum in particular is to make sure that at any step on the way to build the final product, that we have the opportunity to make changes, to be adaptive, okay? So the product backlog item is ever changing. Things can be added, things can be removed, things can be reprioritized, etc., etc. And it contains a list of ordered items by the product owner. And I told you the product backlog item is owned and managed solely by the product owner. Nobody else is putting things in the product backlog without prior approval from the product owner. Okay. Even the dev team is not allowed to create and put user stories in the product backlog without having the approval from the product owner. Okay. That's really important as well. They're going to be asking you that question. Who is responsible for managing the product backlog? They're going to be giving you 4 or 5 options. Is it the Scrum team? Is it the dev team? Is it the dev team with the approval from the product owner? Is it a Scrum Master? And the answer would be the dev team with the approval of the product owner. If again they talk to the product owner, they can add stuff in there, but the whole product backlog is owned and managed by the product owner. So the main person who adds things into the product backlog is the product owner. But if not, the dev team can add stuff in there, but with the approval of the product owner. Okay, so items are added to the product backlog based on risks, business value, dependencies they needed. And that's actually the criteria that we use to order or to prioritize. That's what it means. Ordered means in this case prioritizing. Okay. So all those items, as long as they get into the, as soon as they get into the product backlog, they're getting prioritized based on those 4 criteria: risk, business value, dependencies, and date. Okay. Any feature added to the backlog is commonly written into user story, or also epic. And we defined the other day what an epic is. What is an epic? What's an epic? An epic is a high-level story. It's a big story that needs to be broken down, basically. Okay, that's all. So it's really usually not defined and detailed as a user story. Okay, so that's the only difference. And the dependency, the hierarchy, in terms of size, is usually you have an epic, and under an epic, you have multiple user stories, because you can break down any features that you have in an epic, which is a big story, into multiple stories. So you have an epic here, and then you have under it multiple user stories, okay, that are depending on the epic. The product backlog is the what of the what that we need to build, right? And it is sorted in relative order, the relative order that it should be built in, okay, based on those criteria. It's open and editable by anyone. Product owner is ultimately responsible for ordering the stories on the backlog for the dev team, okay? So it's open and editable by anyone. But one thing that I just told you, anyone, meaning with the approval of the product owner, okay? That's something very important. All right, so how do we build an initial product backlog item? I mean, it's simple. Initially, when we create a project, there's a meeting that is organized with the any stakeholders that has a take into the project or the product, and that the product owner is representing. So the product owner is going to meet with those stakeholders. They're going to be negotiating between DM to see what's part of the project, what's part of the product, okay, on a high level. Because again, the flexibility of Scrum is allowing them not to define every single thing, waste time on defining every single thing initially. All right, they can define things high level, and then as the process is going and as we're building the product, we can adjust things. Okay, so they're finding a common ground from that discussion, negotiation, and they manage the changing requirements as needed. That's what I just explained. So as the time goes by and as they know more, or as there are more changes coming through the product backlog, then we're reassessing the product backlog item, we're prioritizing the product backlog, and all the elements that needs to be removed or changed are effectively done either during the sprint review or during the refinements. Okay, and to that negotiation, you can have customers, final product vendors, owners, directors, CEOs, managers, etc. And the output is the high-level initial product backlog. Okay, and it's never finished. The product backlog item is never finished. It's something that is ever changing, like I said before. Okay, let's stop here. Questions?
Just to make sure I got it right. So this initial building of the product backlog happened outside of a sprint. So this is prior to the first sprint.
Correct. This is what we spoke about the other day, right? Like you have a time where you start building even a small product backlog on a high level with what you think you need. Okay, and it's going to happen before the first sprint. And during the first sprint, you're going to have what's the first meeting that you're going to have? The sprint planning, right? That's where you're going to be discussing a little more about what you want to do for that sprint. You might refine some items from the product backlog before you can actually work them, and it happens on the sprint planning. Okay, but yes, you need to have take some time at the beginning of the project to build the initial backlog, because if that's not done, then there's nothing for the team to work on the first sprint. Does that make sense? Okay. Any other question? All right. So when we build the product backlog, essentially we're creating user stories. It can be also epics, which are, like I said, big user stories. But the user stories that are written are actually written from the user perspective. It's usually not that technical, but it's actually based on a use case that is bringing value to the company or to the customer, basically. Okay, so instead of a use case like we saying in the waterfall model, the product owner creates user stories. Okay, and there are three things that enter into that user story. The definition of the user story is the who is the user, right, of that feature that the user story is describing. The what's the goal, what are we trying to accomplish, and the why, for what reason. Okay, and I gave you an example yesterday as we were talking about the studying and prepping for the certification. So in our case, I was saying, as a user, as a student, I want to clear the PSM certification so I can get a Scrum Master job. Okay, so that would be on a high level, a really simple user story, right? And describing those, responding to those 3 questions in that user story. Okay, another example would be, as a user, I want to log in, developing a software application, for example. As a user, I want to log in so I can access the subscriber content. Okay, and I was telling you yesterday when we spoke about the capacity, the estimating, and the velocity, that every single story ultimately, after it's getting refined, meaning we're adding more details into that story, we're adding acceptance criteria, because the story also has what we refer to as acceptance criteria, which is helping the team, making sure that those are the points that need to be, how can I say, built or fulfilled to deem a user story as done, aside from the definition of done, right? So you might have stuff that are more details that allows you to test the functionality, right? Because the user story, the way it is defined from the user's perspective, might not be enough, right, for the team to understand what is really around it. How do we do it? How do we know we actually build that user story exactly the way it was intended? Okay, so we do have what we refer to as acceptance criteria. Now, after we have the refinement, we added more details, and everybody understands what needs to be done on that story, we need to estimate it. Okay, so we estimate the complexity of the story, and again, that's part of the last slides that we're going to go through for this session. Not today, probably tomorrow, right? So the stories should have an estimate of a relative complexity, right? And some people are using a scale from 1 to 10. Some people are using t-shirt sizes. Some people are using the bus framework, right? Which is big, unknown, or small, right? Some people are using the Fibonacci series. And again, we're going to talk about that later on. But ultimately, what you need to remember from this slide is, when you create a user story, we refine it and we estimate it, how complex it is, okay? And we assign points, relative points, to that story, okay? All right, so this is an example of a product backlog that is prioritized, right? You can see that on your left column, the first column, you do have the product backlog items, right? Those are features that you need to develop. And it is prioritized from high to low, medium, low, etc., etc. And on the last column, you see that you have the story points, right? After an estimate, you assign points to each story. And the way it is ordered, like I said, is from the highest priorities to the lowest priorities. And that's what we're going to be working on before. So everything that is on the top, that means that we need to pick them up for the most current or feature sprints. All right. So whenever we pick something from this backlog, we put it into the sprint backlog, right? It's out of this product backlog. And then anything else that is left is just going to go on the top, from the lowest priority to the highest priorities. And then the next sprint, we're going to be picking up the next highest, and then the next highest, the next sprint. Okay. And showing that that product backlog items and the way it is prioritized is actually to explain to you also that every time you're trying to estimate stories, the most valuable, that meaning the most the highest priority stories are going to be on the top. And usually, since we do not estimate and refine all the stories at the same time, we start with the highest priorities, then you're going to see that it's going to form what we call the product backlog iceberg. Because let's say at the base, you do have a lot of items that are not of the highest priority and are not defined correctly. right? That's going to be your base. It's going to be a lot of them, right? Because it's not waterfall. We don't refine and prioritize every single thing at the same time. We try to prioritize the whole backlog, and whatever we focus on what is priority. Okay? So that means that you're always going to have at the end like a pyramid shape or an iceberg. And the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg that you see is the set of product backlog items that are the highest priorities and defined correctly and refined as well. And you're gonna have few of them, just what you need to be working on the next sprint. Okay, so that's for the sprint. And then at the release level, it's probably what you have that is gonna be part of the work that needs to be done maybe for the 3, 4, 5 sprints before the release, right? But what you're focusing on is what is the highest priority. Let's say you have 20, initially you have 20 product backlog items. You're probably going to be sorting those 20 from the highest to the lowest priority. Now you probably have 5 stories that are very high priority, maybe 5 that are a high priority. You have 5 that are medium priority, or maybe 10 that are medium priority. So at the end, you're going to see that everything else that is medium priority is going to be sitting at the bottom. We don't really care about them for now. We care about refining the 5 that are currently at the very high priority, right? And it's going to be only them that we're using and that we're trying to work as soon as possible. And we refine them. Okay. So at the beginning, I would say you have a product backlog item that is like a big number of clear features. Now you pick the ones that are the highest priority, that brings the most value. You break them down into small stories, you refine them, you estimate them. So as soon as you do that, just a small number is going to the top, right? And those are the ones that you pick up for each sprint that you work. And as you're going through, right, it's like the iceberg is pushing up, like the tip of the iceberg is pushing up. So you pull stuff up, you refine them, you break them down, and then when you're done, you pick them up to be working the sprint, and then you keep doing that. So you don't worry about the lowest priority first. You worry about the highest priority. You define them, you refine them, you point them, and then you work them up. Okay, does that make sense? And that prioritization again is based on the value, the cost, the risk, the date of the different features. Okay. All right. So somebody was asking yesterday about the Jira classes. So this is an example of a product backlog that is in Jira. That's what it looks like. And for each sprint, whenever you're picking up a sprint, you're going to be seeing this option, product backlog. If you click on that, you're going to be seeing the product backlog having the product backlog items and then the sprint backlog. So basically, this backlog is actually just an option that is allowing you to see the sprint backlog item versus the product backlog item. Okay, because I told you when you see this iceberg, every time you pick something from here, it goes up, so it becomes current to be worked on. So you're taking that from the product backlog item, and then it emerges, right? So the same thing is really what happens on the software Jira. When you open this, you click on backlog. This backlog is showing you the sprint backlog and the product backlog. So after every sprint, right, you do pick new items from the product backlog item. So this section is actually the product backlog items. Okay. And this one where you see Mars Landing, this is the sprint backlog. So this is what they're currently working on in this example. Okay. And Mars Landing, that's the sprint goal. I was telling you about the sprint goal, right? This Mars Landing, it can be the goal of that sprint. What are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to develop features that are going to allow for the Mars Landing. So the sprint goal is Mars Landing. Okay. And then under it, what do you need to do? What are the features that are going to fulfill that goal, that sprint goal? Spaceship tracker app needs to be updated. You need to verify the landing site. You need to enter the landing trajectory. You need to send the pre-landing reports, do the cleanup, and hire the team. Okay, so those are the user stories that are under that sprint, and the sprint goal is Mars landing. Okay, so whenever you're done with this, and you see there's a start sprint here, when you do the start sprint, then if you come on this this option, that's the sprint dashboard, then you can see, I don't know if I put that here. Oh no, I didn't put it here. Okay, you're gonna see, but that's not something that you need to know for the exam though. That was just to help people who are already on the job or who are trying to get on the job to understand and to visualize how it looks like, especially on Jira, because I told you yesterday almost 70% of the companies are using Jira. Okay, so after you start the sprint, you have your 2 weeks, right? You work all those, and then they're going to change statuses every day, pending, in progress, and completed or done when it's completed. Okay, and when you're done with the sprint, you're going to close the sprint, create another sprint that's going to have a different sprint goal. Let's say Mars exploring, let's say, right after the Mars landing, maybe your next goal is Mars exploring. Okay, and under that, you're going to be moving what are the items from the product backlog that you need to work on for the Mars exploring. And you're going to be moving, dragging, and dropping those. Once you create a sprint backlog, you're going to be dragging all those items from the product backlog I'm sorry, to the sprint backlog. Okay, and every time you're doing it, you have a few things left over in the product backlog, and you can have, like I said before, things getting added to the product backlog, right? So you can do, okay, let's say initially you have 20. The first time you worked on the 6, right? You have what? You have 14 left. This sprint number 2, you're working on the 4, right? You have 10 left. And then in the meantime, the product owner can add new stuff. The product owner can even break down those product backlog items into smaller items as we're doing the refinement. So everything that you have in the product backlog item, don't think is clear, and what is left there is all what you have to do. No, it can be added, it can be modified, it can be deleted. Okay, but with the approval of the product owner and the product owner only. All right, I'm just stopping here. Any confusion? Somebody was asking about Jira yesterday. Does that help? Who was asking about the Jira yesterday? Okay. Any question at all then on the Jira board?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right. So I just showed you a little bit also what the sprint backlog is going to look like, right? When you're moving product backlog items from the product backlog to the sprint backlog, right? So now, simply put, it's easy to understand. So it's a list of work that the dev team needs to address during the sprint, right? The plan to deliver it and the sprint goal. I was telling you yesterday that that's a tricky question. So they're asking you, what's the sprint backlog? It's not only the product backlog items that need to be completed during the sprint. In addition to that is the plan to deliver it. Okay, meaning what tasks do we need to undertake on the product backlog items that were selected for the sprint? Who is going to do what? Okay, some people are estimating even putting hours on tasks. How long is going to take? So that's what makes it the plan to deliver those product backlog items. Okay, and the sprint goal. I mentioned to you in the previous slide that an example of a sprint goal would be Mars landing. Right, that's the sprint goal. So everything that we're working on for that sprint is toward that goal. That's the sprint goal. So those 3 things are what makes the sprint backlog. That's the definition of the sprint backlog. It's not only the user story that needs to be worked on during the sprint. It's those three things: the list of the work, the plan to deliver it, and the sprint goal. Okay, so you have stories and features that are selected from the top of the product backlog until the dev capacity is reached out. So that means that as I was explaining, you do have the highest priority stuff up. Those are the ones that you're taking first. As you're taking those, you see what are the story points for each of those items, right? Once you have the story points, you keep adding them up, and you already know what's the capacity or the velocity of the team, right? If it is 80 points, then you keep taking stories from the highest priority to the lowest till you reach those 80 points, right? So every time you do the sprint planning, that's the approach that you're following. So the stories and the features are selected from the top of the product backlog, so meaning from the highest priority to the lowest priority until the capacity of the team is of the dev team is reached. Okay. And you have tasks on the sprint backlog that are never assigned. I was telling you yesterday, the team is self-organizing. Everyone is picking up the tasks that he or she wants to work on, right? And the team needs to be in the meeting, in the sprint planning meeting, together, and as a group themselves decide who's going to work on what. There's no team lead, there's no manager in the dev team. Everyone is at the same level. There's no hierarchy. Okay, so everyone is picking what he wants to do just to help the product increment to be delivered, right? So the team is helping itself out. Like everybody wants to do its best to help delivering the product. Okay, so nobody's assigning any task to anyone. People are volunteering. So the sprint backlog is a property of the dev team and include all the estimated stories that we picked up from the product backlog, and they are only provided by the dev team. So it means that the product owner cannot force the dev team to make changes in the sprint backlog. They cannot. If that has to happen, it needs to be a negotiation. Okay, because the dev team knows what needs to be done, right? And only them are estimating the stories. So the product owner is going to tell them, okay, we need to develop this feature and this feature and this feature. What is the estimate for those? That's the role of the dev team, who's going to say, okay, based on the details that we've seen and the refinement that we did, we think is complex enough to be a 3 or a 4, or not a 4. If you go on a Fibonacci, you probably don't have a 4, but is a 3, is a 5, is a 8, is a 13, right? Is it a 21, etc. Once they do that, they put all the stories that were estimated into the sprint backlog, and they decide what they cannot do for that sprint because they're over capacity, and the product owner cannot push more than what they said they can work on. Okay, there's no change. I said it yesterday, I believe. There's no change in the sprint backlog that endangers the sprint. That's why I was saying the product owner cannot impose any amount of work to the dev team or modify the sprint backlog unless it is negotiated with the dev team. And the dev team is the one who's going to know whether or not making any change to the product, the sprint backlog, is going to jeopardize the product increment or the sprint goal. Okay, so the estimated work that is remaining daily is graphed, or there's a line or a chart that we do show the team every day. That's the burnout chart. I'm going to show that to you also later on. But all the estimated work is tracked daily on a chart that is called, usually they use the burn down chart for the sprints. You can also have burn down charts for the release. You can have burn up charts. I'm going to show that to you in a few seconds. You can have burn up charts as well. Okay, so every day we look at how much work was already done. So if we had 80 points, that's actually how you design the burnout chart. And it's a helpful chart that allows you to know how much work you've already done, and what is left in terms of story points. So initially you will have at the beginning of the sprint, let's say that the team picked up a number of stories that are that are adding up to 80 points to their capacity, right? And the first few days, they're going to be completing maybe 2 stories of 5 points, right? That means that they burned 10 points, right? So initially they have 80 points. After 2 days, they burned 10 points because they completed 2 stories. Now their remaining story points is 70, right? And as the time goes by, they're going to be burning more points because they're achieving some work. They're completing stories. That's how the burnout chart is actually designed. And that's what it helps you to see. It helps you to see the remaining work for the sprint at any time, and usually daily. Okay, question. All right. Okay, so this is what it really looks like. I was telling you before that the sprint backlog is the list of work that needs to be completed for the sprint, plus the plan to deliver it, which